Okay. I guess she's going to sit right there today. You sitting right there today? All right. In the 1930s, America believed that some children were born too stupid to ever learn. If your IQ was low, the science of the day said that it was hopeless. Your blood was bad. Thousands of orphans were locked away in institutions labeled feeble-minded and forgotten. But in a quiet corner of Iowa, two young researchers were about to prove the entire country wrong, using the very children that everyone else had written off. Hey y'all, I'm Christina and you're listening to History and Hearsay. So this is the story that I started out intending to tell you guys, but then I turned it into a 3-part series. So if you haven't watched the other two, don't worry. I will do a quick recap on the important details. And of course, you can always go back and watch those after this episode. I will have them linked down below. As we talked about in our last episode, eugenics comes up way too often when we're discussing the past. And while the idea that people were born with certain desirable or undesirable traits is mostly a thing of the past, in 1920s America, when it came to intelligence, it was a common belief that some people were born smart, some were not, and there was simply nothing that could be done to change that. The thought was that you got your intelligence from your genetics, so if your parents were low intelligence, then you would be also. Now, back in those days, they referred to them as imbeciles, feeble-minded, or even morons. But of course, they weren't using real scientific tests to establish intelligence. As I mentioned in previous episodes, sometimes all it took was someone thinking that you were different or weird, and you could catch a label that would follow you around for the rest of your life. So, because it was thought that intelligence was a hereditary or genetic thing, there are those who thought the solution was to simply stop those who were unfit from having children. The idea is that they wanted to forcibly sterilize people who they saw as unfit to reproduce. And of course, you could be considered unfit for anything from your skin color all the way to being considered feeble-minded. Now, in my previous episode, we talked about how in 1924, the Virginia State Legislature passed the Virginia Sterilization Act, which provided for the sterilization of people deemed feeble-minded or socially inadequate. Both very broad categories that could essentially apply to anyone that they wanted it to. Now, in my previous episode, we went in depth on Carrie Buck's story, so feel free to use the timestamps to skip past this part if you saw it. But for those who didn't, here's a quick recap. In the 1927 case of Buck versus Bell, the state of Virginia became truly infamous for its legal campaign to forcibly sterilize a young woman named Carrie Buck. The reason given was that they claimed she was feeble-minded. Now, there really was no evidence that Carrie had a low IQ. They used the fact that her mother had been institutionalized and the fact that Carrie had had a child out of wedlock as proof that she was feeble-minded. Since feeble-mindedness was thought to be hereditary and giving birth out of wedlock was seen as immoral, and the thought back then was that being feeble-minded automatically meant that you were immoral and vice versa. Never mind the fact that Carrie was pregnant as a result of an assault, and there was actual evidence to prove that she was not feeble-minded at all. And of course, even if she had been low intelligence, obviously this still would not have been okay. Unfortunately for Carrie, there really was no one fighting for her, as she was given a lawyer who was known to agree with eugenic sterilization. She lost her case and was forcibly sterilized. Carrie had basically been set up to lose in court so that the people pushing these agendas could get a case on the books that would set a legal precedent for future sterilization going forward. And it worked. Buck versus Bell paved the way for 8,000 state-mandated sterilizations in Virginia and more than 60,000 across the United States. As this ruling was used to forcibly sterilize both men and women over the next several decades and became a source of national shame. And unfortunately, eugenics was not some fringe cult. It was taught at Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. It was funded by the Carnegie Institution and the Rockefeller Foundation. The president of the American Psychological Association called it the hope for the human race. The central claim for the feeble-minded part of this movement was that intelligence is 80 to 90% inherited. If you could save the gene pool, you could save the nation. As proof for these claims, they would direct people to just look at children in orphanages. Children who grew up in institutions almost always tested as feeble-minded. That was the proof. Or so they thought. Now, 2 episodes ago, we talked about Sarah Annie Wittenmyer, and she's the one who started the Home for Orphans in Davenport. So once again, if you want to hear that full story, you can go check it out. But a quick recap of her story is that she was a very charitable woman in the Civil War era who worked really hard to help her community. And while she was involved in multiple different charities in her lifetime, she's probably the most remembered for the work that she did helping soldiers during the war and the children's home that she started. As we discussed previously, the soldiers she was helping thanked her for her help, but asked her if she would use her resources to help their families instead. So, using money Annie had raised in the community and from the soldiers themselves, she opened her first orphans home in the summer of 1864 in Farmington, Iowa. The Civil War took the lives of more than 13,500 Iowa men, and many more were so sick or badly wounded that they could no longer support their families. This resulted in lots of children needing caregivers. By 1865, the Farmington home was completely overcrowded, and a second home was already under construction in Cedar Falls, but the list of waiting children needing a home was so long that the decision was made to move the original home to a larger facility. With the war having come to an end, the government donated the deserted barracks at Camp Kingsman in Davenport, Iowa, and by November, the first 150 children had arrived to live at the new location of the Iowa Children's Orphans Home. Annie was matron of the home for several years before it was taken over by the state of Iowa in June of 1866. Once the state took over the children's home, it became a tax-supported institution, making the children who lived there wards of the state. This was done in order to give the family financial stability and to protect the interest of the orphans. By the mid-1870s, the Civil War orphans had all grown up and left the home, but there were still plenty of children who needed a home, and they began to accept orphans from all over the state. As much as we talk about the horrors of many children's homes in the past, this was one that truly seemed to be doing what children's homes claim to do. They were continuing to evolve and give these children the best they could as the home grew and changed over the years. At one point, the setup changed to where the kids were all living in small cottages with house parents, which really gave them more of a traditional family structure that children tend to thrive in. There was a grammar school on campus, and they even worked to make sure that kids would be able to get jobs once they aged out of the system. This was started in the 6th grades, where students would spend their mornings in the classroom, and then the second half of their school day was spent learning a practical trade from staff members. And there were several different trades that the students could choose from. The home had its own tailor shop, dry goods, canteen, and even extensive farmlands. The farm eventually grew to almost 300 acres. In addition to all of that, the residents in the community surrounding the home really took an active role in having the children's home as part of their community, with the whole community coming out for picnics and parades. Instead of there being a stigma attached to having grown up in the home, the community was proud of the home and how well they took care of the children. And unlike many of the tragic stories we talk about, when parents hit hard times and made the difficult choice to send their children to the home for a short while until they got back on their feet, when they returned, it was to find children who had been well cared for, and they were actually able to bring their children back home. After all of the horror stories we've talked about, finally reading about a children's home that actually gave the children the care they deserved was refreshing, which made me really sad to find out about how things changed. When you read about this children's home, most of the sources skip from the 1870s to 1949, when the home was renamed to honor Ann Wittenmyer. But the subject of today's topic is centered around what happened in the 1920s and 30s with the home, and that was a little more difficult to find information on. But from what I was able to piece together from various things that I read about this time period, it sounds as though after the home transitioned to the cottage system, where the children were living with adults in a more traditional family-style home, the core mission began evolving from simply housing the children to placing them with families via a system that was similar to modern-day foster care. Now, around 1929 is when the orphan trains stopped operation in Iowa, which I do have a previous episode where I talked about that. But the orphan trains were used to relocate children to new homes, and those were no longer in service. Around Around that same time, you had the Great Depression, and many orphanages were closing down due to a lack of resources. So both of these things together led to the Iowa Children's Orphans Home, which had previously offered such incredible care with support from the community, to become overrun with children needing a home. So I read this book that helped to fill in some of the gaps in my research. If you guys want to check that out, I know some of y'all really like a good book recommendation, but it's by Marilyn Brookwood, and it's called The Orphans of Davenport, Eugenics, the Great Depression, and the War over Children's Intelligence. In her book, Marilyn says that by the 1920s, the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home, that is such a mouthful, was already the primary home for children in the area who needed a place to live. Now, at that time, the children stayed until they were about 21 years old. But by the summer of 1935, the Great Depression had transformed the institution into a place that was crammed with infants and older babies. Many were born in the indigent ward in the hospital. Now, some were given up because they were born to parents who couldn't afford to feed the children they already had, or they were born to mothers whose husbands had left them, or they were born to prostitutes who couldn't sustain themselves and a child. Then you had the children who were removed from their families by the courts due to various factors such as mental or physical abuse. You also had those that were born to feeble-minded mothers, which in some cases were just mothers who were dealing with postpartum depression in a time before anyone really knew what that was or how to help with it. So they would be labeled unfit to parent, and the child would be taken away. All of this together led to extreme overcrowding, which led to neglect. Nurses didn't have time to cuddle and feed babies, and so they would simply prop up their bottles and move on to the next child. They were only picked up to have their diapers changed and then laid back down in bed again. No one spent time talking to them or comforting them when they cried. The home was run like a factory. Efficiency was everything. Now, when I first started researching this, I thought it was going down a really dark path that we've been down before, but there's nothing to indicate that the nurses were intentionally cruel. They simply didn't have the time for anything non-essential. And of course, at this time, no one realized that cuddles for a baby are essential. While this is still extremely tragic, it turns out that the workers at the home were just completely overwhelmed and they were doing their best to simply keep the children alive, and that was the reason for the extreme emotional neglect. Some of the children would rock back and forth in their beds, which was seen as a sign of mental illness. Of course, today we know that this is a self-soothing technique that can often stem from neglect. These children were completely alone and soothing themselves the best they could. Now, at this time, those doing private adoptions were very selective in the children that they offered up for adoption, mostly using eugenics-based reasoning, like if the parents were feeble-minded or known criminals, the assumption was that the child was also going to grow up to be feeble-minded or have bad character. Fortunately, regular old people didn't seem to pay much attention to the chatter that was going on in the academic circles of the world. Middle-class, educated Iowans with professional standing regularly adopted children who were from families with the lowest social and economic status. Because these everyday people didn't buy into the eugenics ideas about a child's genetics, they didn't ask questions about their background. They simply saw a child in need, they had the love to share and the means to help, and so they did. But things changed a bit when a couple who had adopted a son from the state complained that they had been given a feeble-minded child. They were upset because they wanted a child who could inherit their farm, and they felt that this child would not be capable of that. Adoptions were considered permanent. The state had a no takesy-backsy rule, and so these parents sued the state over it. Ultimately, the parents won, and the state got really nervous about what this could mean for adoptions in the future, and that fear caused them to implement a new rule. All children had to be administered an intelligence test, and if they scored below average, that child would not be eligible for adoption and would be transferred to an institution for the mentally handicapped. The most fortunate of the children at the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans home, between 2 and 6 months old, who appeared to be normal and healthy, were adopted out to financially secure middle-class families. Those freed up beds that were then quickly filled with more babies. Older babies and toddlers were also adopted out, but this happened less frequently due in a large part to the now mandated IQ tests that all children were to receive. Children were tested when they arrived at the home and often tested in the normal IQ range. But when they were tested again after 1 year of living in the home, they tested into the feeble-minded range, which of course meant that child was no longer eligible for adoption and would be transferred to an institution for the feeble-minded, as the children's home was for normal children. Sadly, once they were institutionalized, most would remain there for the rest of their lives. At the time, the decline in IQ wasn't considered a red flag because it was something that was expected, especially if the child's mother was institutionalized. Caregivers and researchers just assumed that the child's genetics were finally showing through. Now, you might be wondering where these IQ tests came from in the first place. Well, in 1905, French psychologist Alfred Binet was tasked by the French government to identify children who needed special education. This led Binet to creating the first modern intelligence test, which led to the concept of the intelligence quotient, or IQ test. Binet's method became known as the Binet-Simon scale, named after Binet and his assistant Theodore Simon. This method used simple tasks like naming objects, following commands, and copying drawings to assess a child's intellectual development relative to their peers. The results of the test would then establish a mental age for the subject based on their responses. Prior to Binet's test, doctors had no way of assessing the intelligence of the mind apart from the body, and they would often misdiagnose children with physical disabilities as having mental disabilities as well. Binet's test was able to help doctors discover a better way of evaluating their patients. He suggested that there was not one single thing that determined intelligence, but multiple things like comprehension, judgment, reasoning, and intention. He said that only judgment was fundamental. And when he said judgment, he was referring to the quality of the child's logic. Binet understood that children were limited by their experience and environment. For example, when he asked children the difference between a fly and a butterfly, he discovered that some children had never seen a butterfly. He was one of the first to recognize the role that environment played, and he made this discovery by working with children one-on-one and evaluating them on a case-by-case basis. Though this was developed for educational support, it was later adapted by other researchers for use in different fields and led to other tests like the Stanford Binet. The use of IQ tests started to gain popularity in the United States in the 1920s. People seemed to be fascinated by them, though unfortunately they weren't being used in the way that Binet had intended. There were lots of generalizations being made due to the influence of eugenics, as most professional psychologists at the time believed that intelligence was static throughout a person's lifetime and was completely hereditary. And IQ test ranges at that time came with labels for those who tested below normal, with moron being those with mild intellectual disability. Then you had imbecile, which for an adult would mean that they had an IQ of a normal 7 to 10-year-old. And finally, idiot, which for adults would mean that they scored in the range that you would expect from a 0 to 2-year-old child. Now, I'm not sure how this translated to children, but that's just kind of an example of the ranges that were considered below average and how they ranked them from moron to imbecile and then finally idiot. Harold Manfield Skeels was born on March 8, 1901 in Denver and grew up in small towns across northern Iowa where his father was a minister. He graduated from Iowa State College with a degree in animal husbandry and received a PhD in child development in 1932. From 1932 to 1942, he held joint appointments with the Child Welfare Research Station in the Iowa Board of Control of State Institutions and was responsible for a large number of studies which used institutional populations as subjects. Maurice Skodak was born on January 10, 1910 in Ohio. Her parents were both teachers and recent immigrants from Hungary. Marie developed an interest in chemistry and psychology and attended Ohio State University. While she was in school, the hardships of the 1920s and 30s began to hit America. Now, the Midwest was affected sooner than the rest of the country, which meant that the effects lasted longer, and so these states were some of the ones that were impacted the most. And this meant that all of her parents' carefully laid plans for paying for her education crumbled as they lost everything. Marie had to find work if she wanted to stay in school. She found a job working as a waitress. She'd initially planned to study chemistry, but looking at the collapsing economy around her made her reconsider her career goals, but began to think that a job as a teacher would be a more stable choice. However, as she began waiting tables, she was extremely interested in the discussions that the psychologists were having around their tables. During this time, Marie also took a child psychology course that was required as part of her teaching degree, and the class was taught by a woman who had become very successful in a field that had previously been dominated by men, and ultimately she decided that she too could have success in this field, and she decided to pursue a degree as a psychologist. After her first class, Marie was hooked and took almost every psychology course that the university offered. When Marie was a young girl, her mother had become homesick and abandoned her daughter to return to Hungary. Although she had left her with her father and eventually returned, it was to find a very changed little girl. Marie would later talk about how hard that period of her life had been and describe the whole experience as traumatic. And perhaps this terrible experience is what made Marie so perfect for the work that she would ultimately give her life to. Marie's education focused on school psychology, and by 1931, she had earned 2 degrees, an undergraduate teaching degree and a master's degree in clinical psychology. Normally, her incredible credentials would have landed her numerous job offers, but unfortunately, with the current state of the world, many positions had been eliminated. So, a very accomplished 21-year-old Marie sent out a bunch of applications. She said it was probably 100 or so, and just when she was starting to get discouraged that she wasn't going to hear back, she gets 2 letters. One of them was from Ohio State saying that she had been appointed to a senior assistantship. That's what it was called, but that just doesn't sound right. A senior assistantship in the clinic, which would involve assisting Henry Goddard and Francis Maxfield with anything that they needed, and also supervising the trainees in the clinic. Now, at this point, Henry Goddard had started using the IQ test that Binet had developed. This was a half-time appointment, meaning that Marie could take classes part-time and start working towards her PhD. The second letter she got was from the Rome State School in New York, which was an institution for the mentally retarded, which is what they called people of low intelligence back then. This school was regarded as the most outstanding and forward-looking kind of institution. The position with the Rome School was a summer appointment, and the one assisting Goddard didn't start until the next school year in September, and so she would be able to take both of these positions as they were kind of like back-to-back. So at the Rome School, Marie's job was to give student achievement tests to the incoming students to see where they should place them. And part of the job was socializing the inmates of the institution. So this job gave her a lot of hands-on experience for understanding people with mental disabilities. So once both of those jobs had completed, in the summer of 1933, Marie was kind of trying to figure out what she was going to do next for a job when she passed a bulletin board and saw a letter from Harold Skeels saying that the Iowa State Welfare Research Station had a summer position for someone who was interested in doing intelligence testing and assessments for school-age children who were in various institutions. Now, this sounded exactly like what she had just done in her previous position, and so Marie applied to the job, and she was offered the job, but they warned her that this was going to be very different than what she was used to at the Rome School. The University of Iowa's Children Welfare Research Station opened in 1917 as the world's first center focused on studying the normal child. Made possible by large grants from the Laura Spelman Memorial of the Rockefeller Foundation, this station worked to scientifically understand childhood, transforming it from what had always been a focus of charity into a field of study, which ultimately impacted generations of children and families over the decades. Now, this station was much different than anything else out there at the time. Not only was their particular field of study unique, since no one else was studying children in this way, but they had a very unique location and structure for the way that they went about things. And all of this made a big difference in the things that they were able to achieve. Many of the top research universities at the time, like Stanford, Harvard, and Princeton, were located in culturally rich areas of the nation. While the location of the University of Iowa's Children Welfare Research Station was considered a backwater, with only 5% of the state's roads being paved and only 10% of its homes having electricity. But this location might have been part of the secret sauce that made this station so successful, because at the time, most universities were so full of bureaucracy that their research was really hindered. The Iowa station, by contrast, had a very uncommon freedom that allowed what some would consider radical studies to take place without much attention from psychology's mainstream. By the time that Harold Skeels joined the station in the 1930s, George Stoddard was director of the station. Now, he had previously studied with a colleague of Benet's and was convinced that environment played a role in intelligence. So it's believed that Stoddard's personal beliefs, which were considered very unorthodox at the time, were part of what led to the researchers at the Iowa station having so much freedom, something that was extremely rare in the world of psychology at that time. And when new researchers joined the team, they were surprised to see studies being done that pushed back against society norms. Researchers in the big universities would later admit that whenever they had an idea that was contrary to the accepted norm, they would often choose not to pursue it so that they wouldn't offend their colleagues. Which I can't imagine how you would have any breakthroughs if that's kind of how you did things. So again, this is part of what made the Iowa station so special. They had none of that stuff going on. They were doing actual science by pursuing things wherever the facts took them, regardless of whether it was popular or not. And from what was written about this station, there seemed to be a really good environment of debating ideas without anyone allowing their own personal pride to get in the way of finding the truth. It was like actual research was being done there. When Harold Skeels and Marie Skodak joined the station, they brought with them the viewpoints that they had learned in university, which of course lended towards eugenic ideals. And they were some of the ones that were surprised to hear discussions being had at Iowa stations, in particular, the ones about how much environment might actually have to do with things like intelligence. Luckily, both Skeels and Skodak were known to be extremely compassionate and open-minded professionals. Okay, so we talked a bit earlier about how the state of Iowa was sued over the adoption of the mentally handicapped boy, and how the state decided they couldn't risk another lawsuit, which is why they started mandating the intelligence tests. So in order to make this happen, they called upon the University of Iowa's Child Welfare Research Station. When Marie joined the station in the summer of 1933, she learned that they had been truthful with her. The institutions she was going into were very different than what she was used to. The Rome School was an institution that treated its residents very well. It was well funded and well managed. The staff was highly trained and treated the children very well. They provided educational stimulation and real-world experiences for the residents, helping them to learn to do many things for themselves. However, the institutions that she went to while doing her work with the Iowa station was quite a different story. She was now visiting institutions with overworked staff who, in most cases, had not been trained for the positions they held and had no time to give individualized care to the residents. As Marie spent the entire summer testing children across these various institutions, she noticed how clingy all the children were. Many of them had been abandoned, as I mentioned earlier, and they were all hungry for adult attention. When the summer term was up, Marie felt extremely sad to leave. She was worried that the children would think that she was yet another adult who had abandoned them. So when Harold Skeels was named as Iowa's first state psychologist, and offered Marie a job as his assistant, she eagerly agreed. Between the financial hardships caused not only by the Great Depression, but also the national disasters that hit the nation around that time, such as the Dust Bowl winds, historic heat, the worst drought on record in the last 1,000 years, and then the ice storms that ravaged farms and killed livestock, Iowa's economy stood no chance. It was brutal, and poverty-stricken, hopeless parents began giving their children up to the state, packing the already crowded children's home in Davenport to overflowing. By the 1930s, the Davenport home, which was meant to house around 400 children, housed more than 700. At this point, the untrained, underpaid, and overwhelmed cottage matrons were too busy to even provide the children with clean clothing or offer adequate hygiene. And this is what led to all the things I mentioned earlier about how babies were extremely isolated and neglected, with the staff not having any time to cuddle or hold them. And so the bottles for the babies were just being propped up for feedings. And in addition to all of that, in an effort to prevent sickness from spreading, the cribs of these young babies were wrapped in sheets. Now, this practice was not something that was done in regular family settings, but it was often done in institutions, and it was based on the unfounded belief that this could somehow block sickness from spreading to the young babies. So these young babies, who would remain in the cribs for the first 6 months, had almost no human interaction and couldn't even see what was going on in the room around them. Except for the brief moments when they were picked up for a diaper change, the only thing they could see was the light as it streamed in from the sun before it went dark again at night. When psychologist Harold Skeels began administering IQ tests to the children in the Davenport home, assisted by his colleague, psychologist Marie Skodak, the two made a perfect team. They were both known to be extremely compassionate, had a strong desire to change things for the better, and were very interested in learning the circumstances surrounding each child's family history. And as they experienced firsthand how these hardships affected the children, these scientists, along with the rest at Iowa Station, turned their backs on tradition and dug into anything they found that was promising. It started with Beth Wellman's discovery of the positive effects of preschool on children and blossomed from there. Beth Wellman had been at the station since 1925, and her research led her to discover that going to preschool increased young children's intelligence scores. The more they realized that children's intelligence changed with environment changes, the more they dug in and sought to learn more. They were willing to challenge the status quo and each other. This led them to developing a case study method of looking at children's individual history and experience. One of the biggest things that was different about what they were doing is what today we would call field studies, where they went out and observed children in their real-world environments such as preschool. At the time, this was a rarely used method which allowed the Iowa scientists to discover things that defied the beliefs held in their field at the time. On one of his visits in 1938, Harold Skeels observed two little girls ages 13 months and 16 months sitting on the floor crying and rocking back and forth. He described it this way. The youngsters were pitiful little creatures. They were tearful, had runny noses, and coarse, stringy, and colorless hair. They were emaciated, undersized, and lacked muscle tone or responsiveness. Sad and inactive, the two spent their days rocking and whining. The ward where these little girls were had dozens of children with only 2 nurses to look after them. Many of these children had lived their lives wrapped in cribs, so neglected that even though their hearing was perfectly fine, they didn't turn towards voices or respond to noises of any kind. One of the key roles of the Iowa Soldiers Orphans home at the time was to find homes for these children. But while an IQ score of 100 was considered normal, these girls had IQs of 35 and 46, which meant they were in the retarded range and by state law were ineligible for adoption. The protocol was that once children tested as low intelligence, the psychologists were supposed to then have them transferred to an institution for the mentally handicapped. But Skeels wanted to find a way to save these 2 young girls from that fate. So he used the extreme overcrowding at the Iowa Soldiers Orphans home in Davenport as an excuse to place them with female residents in a home for the feeble-minded, where they would live with adult women who had been labeled as morons. When Skeels returned 3 months later, he was astonished at what he had found. The 2 little girls were nearly unrecognizable. They were bundles of energy, full of life, and responsive to those around them. If he hadn't placed them there himself, he would not have believed that these were the same children. When he measured their IQs, they came in at 77 and 87, no longer considered retarded. This was measured again a few months later, and IQs for both girls were now close to being considered normal with scores in the mid-90s. This went against everything that he had ever been taught. If you were mentally defective, you weren't supposed to be able to overcome that. What in the world had happened? So to figure that out, Skeels began questioning the women who lived in the ward and also the nurses. And at the same time, he also began observing them as they all interacted together. What he observed is that one woman had taken over one of the children and acted as a mother figure, while the others surrounded her and the child like adoring aunties. This meant that not only was it just their basic needs that were being met, these children were now being surrounded with constant love and affection. The residents played with and talked constantly to the children. The ladies used their allowances to purchase toys and even made colorful clothes for them to wear. While there was obviously a pronounced difference in the children, the women of the ward thrived from being able to display motherly love, and they catered to the children's every need. Skeels was so excited with these results, and he had to find out if this is something that he could repeat. So he set up an unconventional test. He selected 11 children from the Davenport Children's Home who were between the ages of 1 and 2, who had average IQs of 64, which had them labeled as mentally retarded and meant that they were ineligible for adoption. So he took these children and placed them with women at a home for the feeble-minded. Now, these women ranged anywhere from teenage to women in their 50s, but because they were mentally much younger, many of the writings from the psychologists at the time refer to them as girls. So some sources have called them teenagers, but it was kind of a mix, and a lot of the girls or women there were only mentally in the age range of 7 to 9 years old. Each woman in the home was taught how to provide basic care and attention for the babies. They were taught how to hold, feed, talk to, and stimulate the children. The children also attended a half-morning kindergarten program at the institution, which I'm assuming since they were only like 1 to 2 years old, that was probably more like a basic preschool, but they called it a kindergarten. So in the study that Skeels set up, the children would be tracked against a control group of children who stayed at the Davenport Orphanage. The control group was 12 children under the age of 3 years old. They had their basic needs met, but essentially nothing else. So they basically just kept these children the same way they already were without changing anything. They weren't receiving any type of individual care or anything like that. They didn't take anything from them, essentially just left them how they were already being treated. The children in the control group had an average starting IQ of 86. 2 years later, the group in the experiment, who had been sent to live with the women, were retested and had gained an average of 27.5 IQ points, which meant... Okay. Do you want to say something? Or are you just interrupting? You can't see my mic because of my black shirt, which is why I have it like that on purpose. But she's so light colored, she always messes with the visuals when she gets here. You just want to be snuggled? All right. Well, why don't you sit down? I'm going to have to figure a better setup so she can sit where she wants to sit, because I feel like I'm perching at weird angles whenever I record an episode so that she's comfortable. And I'm like, girl, I'm trying to work here. 2 years later, the group in the experiment who had been sent to live with the women were retested and had gained an average of 27.5 IQ points, which meant that all but 2 of the children were now eligible for adoption. Now, oddly enough, the children in the control group who had stayed at the orphanage lost almost the same amount of points as the other ones had gained, at an average loss of 26 IQ points, meaning that most had declined into what was now considered retarded levels of IQ. Now, the psychologists at Iowa Station were so surprised by this test that they went through everything multiple times to ensure that they hadn't gotten anything wrong, but they kept coming back with the same results. Windell was a young boy who had been placed at the orphans' home in Davenport after his mother was institutionalized for her mental health. When he first arrived, he tested at normal intelligence. But like so many others, his intelligence score declined the next year when he was tested again. However, he was one of the lucky ones who was placed in the test group, and after receiving one-on-one love and attention from the women in the institution, his IQ test score increased by 17 points. And while this was one of the smallest gains of the children, it was a breakthrough because once again, it was something that they had not thought was possible. What Harold Skeels began to discover is that IQ is not static, especially in younger years. He came to the realization that since none of these children had any type of organic brain disorder, he could have taken any of these children and swapped places, and the results would have been the same. The results of this study allowed Skeels to begin piecing together the role of environment in childhood development and would become essential to the modern understanding of early development. Intelligence was just as much of an environmental factor as a genetic one, and good parenting requires giving love, care, and attention, which of course, this was groundbreaking stuff at the time. It would take decades, but eventually the results from this study would be confirmed by neuroscientists who were studying brain development. Heredity and environment work together. Windell went on to find a loving family who adopted him. He was given a new name, attended college, and became a university administrator. And as it turns out, Windell's experience was not unique. When Skeels decided to follow up with the children 25 years later, he was able to locate all of the original children from his study. So I read some stuff that said there was 11 kids and other stuff that said there were 13 kids. So I'm wondering if maybe it was 11 plus the 2 original girls who were sent first before he did the larger study with just the 11 kids. But either way, Skeels found all the children, and he found that all but 2 had married, resulting in the births of 9 children, all of whom were of normal intelligence. The median educational level of the original group was 12th grade, and 4 of them had even attended college. Their jobs ranged from homemaker to business and professional work, with only those 2 who had not been adopted working in domestic services. In contrast, the 12 children in his control group that had been left at the orphanage fared far less positively. The median level of education was only the 3rd grade. 4 of them were still institutionalized, and as for the others, all but 1 worked in unskilled jobs. Skeels noted in his follow-up study that if his work could just stimulate some change or further research, then he would consider his work to have been a success. He noted that there's potential in many children that cannot be unlocked because of the condition and environments that they are in. Now, as I mentioned before, Harold Skeels, Marie Skodak, and the rest of the Iowa psychologists were doing something that no one else was doing. By investigating what was required to raise normal children, they were questioning things that no one else had really questioned, at least not on a professional level. Up until this point, the things that were done with children were simply customs. This is what our parents and grandparents did, and so this is what we're doing. No one had really investigated if it was the ideal way to raise a child. But of course, not everyone was happy about this. The work done by the Iowa psychologists in studying institutionalized children from society's lowest social and economic status is described by author Marilyn Brookwood as launching a revolution. The discovery that the interaction between heredity and experience determines much of a child's development, including their intelligence, was something that the leaders of their profession did not want to accept. As I mentioned several times already, most of these leaders were eugenicists who believed that a person's environment played absolutely no role in how they turned out. And they did not want to give up those preconceived notions. They relentlessly attacked the work done by the Iowa psychologists. And this became a drama that played out on the front pages of newspapers and magazines across the country. As amazing as the discoveries they were making were, the pushback was strong, as they did their very best to undermine the work that was coming out of the Iowa station. They misrepresented the scientists' work and accused them of being dishonest. They did their very best to make it sound as though the study's conclusions were based on fantasy rather than facts that could be proven. They even attacked the scientists personally, trying to label their views as authoritarian and even comparing them to Stalin. Essentially, they were doing everything they could to try to make this group of scientists look like quacks. And unfortunately, this seemed to work, as very few people came forward to defend them, and the next generation of scientists were said to pursue less controversial areas. No one else wanted to make themselves a target. The Iowa scientists' impact may have been slowed, but their pursuit was not, as they continued to pursue their studies from a place of empathy and moral concern. They felt that the lives of all children were blighted by this belief that intelligence was fixed at birth. So, despite the damage done to their personal and professional reputations, they continued to argue for early intervention. It was just too important that this work continue. Throughout their studies, the Iowa Psychologist Group was able to study 4 different populations of children: middle-class children, children in orphanages who were exposed to preschool, children who were born to parents in the lowest levels of society and then adopted into middle-class homes before the age of 6 months old, and then children who were identified as feeble-minded who were placed in the care of institutionalized women who were labeled morons. Most psychologists at that time really had no idea what it looked like for children to live in an institution. But the Iowa psychologists confronted this head on. They already had great compassion for these children, and seeing firsthand what these children were going through gave them more understanding and further fueled their resolve to make a difference, even when they began to receive so much pushback. Now, individual Iowans themselves have also been credited with making a huge difference in the field. I mentioned earlier how middle-class educated Iowans with professional standing regularly adopted children who were from families from the lowest social and economic status. And according to all reports, these adoptive families did not ask questions about where these children had come from. This illustrated that everyday people in Iowa didn't really buy into the eugenic ideas about a child's genetics. They simply saw a child in need, had the means to help, and so they did. Not only did this help these individual children, but it also furthered the field of research, as this is what allowed the scientists to conduct studies of adoptees. And as they followed the children into their new homes, they saw the radical shifts in intelligence that once again contradicted the beliefs of the time. In 1949, the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans home was renamed the Annie Wittenmyer home in honor of Annie's hard work and contributions. By the 1960s, the home, which was always changed to fit the needs of Iowa's children, transitioned from an orphanage to a residential facility specializing in special education and behavioral counseling for troubled youth. Changes in Iowa Code 232 in the mid-1960s opened the home to all dependent and neglected children under the age of 12 with emotional, mental, or delinquency problems. In 1966, a mental health unit was built, financed by the sale of unused land. And the 300-acre farm that we talked about way at the beginning of the episode was completely sold off by 1970. In 1975, the Annie Wittenmyer home closed. It's estimated that well over 12,000 children were helped by the home during its 115 years of operation. Although none of the original Civil War camp buildings survived to the present day, the long history of the Annie Wittenmyer home will always be remembered. Despite all of the pushback, the work done by Harold Skeels, Marie Skodak, Beth Wellman, and the other scientists at the Iowa Research Station laid the foundation for the modern concepts of childhood development. However, because of all the pushback, it would not be until the 1960s that mainstream science would once again look at the ideas that these scientists had talked about in the 30s, and would ultimately bring psychology into its modern age.